Pilate, Pontius Pilate, that we know so much about in the Bible, was a prefect. That was his title. He was an equestrian by social order. First of all, let's do some housekeeping. Don't forget about my YouTube channel. If you ever want to see, what did he say? I can't believe he said that. You can go and check it out. And if I said something really stupid, you won't be able to see it because Kenny takes all my stupid things out. Sometimes these 45-minute classes go down to like 2 or 3 minutes. But don't forget the YouTube channel, youtube.com/@DennySism. Don't forget the errata on my website, okay? I went and looked at the errata on my website, and I had a mistake on there. I needed an errata for my errata. Also, Kenny and I are going to be doing a new website coming at the end of the year, I think. I bought a domain called BibleCalculators.com. So we are going to start out by copying over all the calculators that are on my Testament Press website to BibleCalculators.com. We're going to do some changes. Maybe we'll do an app later. I don't know. Don't forget that if you want a book, get it while this class is ongoing. I promise you the prices will increase afterwards. Enough of that. Now, remember this chart? It was kind of our go-to chart for all of our first half of the history, okay? We talked about the Old Testament with the Persians in charge, and then with the Persian period, and then we come along to Alexander the Great, who defeated Darius III, and then we have his successors, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and then the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, then finally the Herodians and the Romans, okay? So that chart has kind of been our go-to chart all along, but I'm going to take that chart now and I'm going to compress it into this little bitty thing right here. And we're going to look at the entire history of Rome. Again, we're going from Judea, which we've been super hyper-focused on. Everything we talked about has been in the context of Judea, okay? Now we're going to pick up and we're going to go over to Rome, the Italian peninsula, and look at what the Romans were doing. There were several different Roman periods of history. There was the monarchy. They had 7 kings, 8, depending on the literature that you read, in this green line here, starting with Romulus and Remus. Romulus killed Remus at one point, and that's why we're talking about the Roman Empire instead of the Reman Empire, right? Now, Star Trek talks about both. We'll talk about Star Trek a little bit later on. They have a Romulan Empire and a Reman Empire, okay? We then have the Republic. We have the early Republic, from the end of the monarchy when Tarquin the Proud was kicked out. We have the early republic until they dominated the Italian peninsula. Okay? We then have the mid-republic to when they dominated the Mediterranean. And then we have the late republic from that domination of the Mediterranean to when who came along? Octavian, and he became Augustus. Octavian was his name. Augustus was his title. Caesar Augustus, his title, the first Roman emperor. And then we have the Roman Empire. Just like every other empire we ever study, right? There's a united empire and there's a divided empire. The Romans are no different. We have the united empire here. Then we have the first division by Diocletian in 285 AD. And then we have the final division by Theodosius, who divided the empire finally into 2 different pieces, an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire, among his 2 sons, Theodosius. And the empire in this period of history right here kind of went back and forth, kind of divided for a while and back together for a while, and divided for a while, back together for a while, okay? And then finally, when Theodosius came along, the empire was finally divided. The Western Empire fell in 476 AD. This ushered in the Middle Ages. Now, when I was a kid, we always talked about the Dark Ages. Some of you are older in here. Remember the Dark Ages? That's not a term really used much anymore. The Dark Ages is really now called the Early Middle Ages. I don't know why. Apparently it's racist or something to call it Dark Ages. I don't know why. I really don't. But anyway, it's now called the Early Middle Ages. So when the Roman Empire fell, specifically the Western Empire fell, that ushered in the Middle Ages, the Early Middle Ages. When the Eastern Empire fell, that was Constantinople. When the empire broke up, Rome and Constantinople were the 2 capitals, okay? Constantinople was called Byzantium at first before it became Constantinople under, guess who? Constantine. They like naming things after themselves, I guess. So it was Byzantium, then Constantinople, and then became Istanbul later on. I'll show you a chart about that in a minute. Okay, so the history that we've been interested in is just right here. That's what we've spent all these weeks covering, just this little piece. Rome history is so much bigger. And we actually pushed our history out a little past the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. The Roman periods, There was the monarchy, 7 kings from 753 to 509 BC, the republic from 509 to 27 BC when Octavian became emperor. The republic was governed predominantly by 2 consuls elected annually. The rule of dictators, Sulla being an important dictator, Julius Caesar being another important dictator, periodically punctuated control of the republic. We'll talk about specifically what dictators are. It's a little bit different Roman-wise versus what we think of today. Okay? 3 distinct periods of the republic, as I mentioned, the early republic, from the end of the monarchy to the dominance of the Italian peninsula, the middle republic from the dominance of the Italian peninsula to the conquest of Carthage and Macedonia and basically the whole Mediterranean basin. We find the Punic Wars with Carthage, those 3 Punic Wars right there. And then we have the late republic from 146 to 27 BC from the conquest of Carthage and Macedonia to Octavian becoming Caesar Augustus. Okay. We then have the empire. The United Empire was begun by Octavian, who became Augustus, continuing until Diocletian divided it into an eastern and western half. And then we have a period of recombination, as I mentioned before, and then finally in 395 AD, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire were finally separated out. The Western Empire fell for a bunch of different reasons. You can read the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. You may want to read that, I don't. But it happened for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons it fell was the emperor, the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus, was removed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. Again, many theories why it collapsed, all beyond the scope of the book. The empire's fall in 476 AD typically marks the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages, as I mentioned. The Eastern Empire, when Theodosius I died in 395, he gave the 2 halves to his 2 sons. And the Eastern Empire had its capital at Byzantium, which became Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. And this empire is often known as the Byzantine Empire. So if you look at coins, for example, you'll see Byzantine coins. Okay, those are from the Eastern Roman Empire. It fell in 1453 when Ottoman Turks sacked Constantinople. So Byzantium was the name of the town, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire at first. That's where we get the Byzantine Empire, okay, from Byzantium. That traces back probably to Bezos. He was a son of Poseidon, one of the Greek gods. Okay, we think that's where the name comes from. It became Constantinople when Constantine became emperor and became his capital city, and then is now Istanbul today. It's the only city, I think, that straddles both Asia and Europe. Okay, if you go to Istanbul today, just prepare. Don't try to use the bathroom in their airport. They got a really, really bad airport. But anyway, that's a story for another time, I guess. Craig is not in here yet. So he had a question last week. If Masada is where the name Mossad came from. And the answer is no, I don't think so. Mossad means institute or institution. Okay, it's kind of like the CIA. We talk about the CIA as the agency, right? Okay. Kind of as a general term for kind of what they do. Well, the same thing for Mossad. It's kind of a general term for what they do. Kind of, they're the institute. They're the institution. But they're really the intelligence institution of the Jewish government. Okay, of Israeli government. That's a shortened name for Hassad Mahib Hawaii. I was reading that from the Hebrew there. I wasn't reading that from here, but of course you have to read that right to left, like I did just now. It translates as the Institute for Intelligence and Special Operations. It was set up in 1949 by David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel. Coordinates and conducts intelligence and covert operations abroad. And it's a bureaucratic, as I mentioned, a bureaucratic sounding name similar to the agency. Craig, I was answering your question from last week and you missed all of it, so you'll have to watch the video. So, yeah. So be sure to watch the video on YouTube. Good. YouTube.com/@DennySissom. All right. All right. So there's the different structures of the Mossad right there. You can see that there's structures for personnel, there's structures for human intelligence, there's structures that interface with other intelligence agencies, that kind of thing. 7 different structures that we know about from unclassified sources. Anybody needs a roach? I have one up here for you. Medieval times started at the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, I was accused last week by someone, I won't mention Maggie's name, but I was accused she asked, how are the Middle Ages? How are medieval times? But I wouldn't mention her name who said that, because that would be wrong. Okay. So anyway, that Middle Ages started at the fall of the Western Empire, and then the Eastern Empire continues at the capital of Constantinople Okay? And then it finally falls in 1453 AD. So the monarchy came first. It was founded by Remus and Romulus back in the day, about 753 BC. Romulus was the first king after he killed his brother Remus. Okay? If it had been the other way around, we'd be talking about the Roman Empire today instead of the Roman Empire. Okay? We'll talk about next week, I think, probably some comparisons, I guess, with science fiction. I talked about that a little bit already. We'll talk about science fiction, facts of history versus science fiction and how they correspond and how science fiction stole a lot of their facts from history. Okay? Probably next week we'll try to talk about that a little bit. Okay? King number 2, Numa Pompilius. Okay? He was a good king. Rome enjoyed peace during this time. He added, he's at fault. He's the one that added January and February to our calendars. We used to have a good, nice 10-month year. Okay? Now we have a 12-month year. And he went, the big dummy, he went and added them at the beginning of the year. Tullus Hostilius, the 3rd king, was a warrior king. Marcius was the 4th king, grandson of Numa Pompilius, a good and peace-loving king like his grandfather. Tarquin the Elder was next. Servius Tullius was the next king, the 6th king. The last king was Tarquin the Proud. And he was so bad, he was a warrior king, but he was so bad that he was finally overthrown, and that was the end of the monarchy. So we have the end of the monarchy, the Roman monarchy, and the beginning of the Roman Republic, the early republic. Okay? So the monarchy is beyond our scope. It all happened before the history of the Intertestament. So that's the only slide we'll talk about that. Let's talk about Roman social order. First of all, the senators. They were the top of the pier, the top of the heap, okay, in the Roman social order of things. By the time of Augustus, there were over 1,000 Roman senators. He reduced that number to about 600. It required wealth. I'm guessing it required maybe $11 million of wealth. Okay, if you go to my website, you can put in 250,000 denarii or 1 million sesterces, and you'll see that it's about $11 million. You know, maybe 5 to 20 million. We don't know. But that's kind of a good guess. That kind of gives you a clue of where the senators were wealth-wise. It was all about wealth in the Roman Empire. There were about 300 and 900 families throughout history. They were aristocratic or patrician. They controlled the government, and they could, later in the empire, be plebeians. We'll talk about them. They were the lowest tier of Roman social order, the plebeians. Next up, the equestrians. They were below the senators. The Roman cavalry was made up of equestrians during the Republic. They were the plebeian nobility. They were wealthy and businessmen generally. Okay, they could accept public contracts. They could become senators even. They required about 100,000 denarii worth, or maybe about $4 million, $4 to $5 million, somewhere in there. They had a similar standing socially as senators. They could hold offices, in fact, exceeding those of senators, like commander of the fleet of Rome, commander of the security police in Rome, oversaw the supply of food for Rome, governor of Egypt, commander of the Praetorian Guard, for example. These were the equestrians, about 1/10 of 1% of the population. During the Empire period, they lost much of their influence because who was in charge in the Empire period? The Roman emperors. They were in charge of pretty much everything. Pilate, Pontius Pilate, that we know so much about in the Bible, was a prefect. That was his title. He was an equestrian by social order. Okay? The prefect was title. Equestrian was his social standing. Okay? Next up, the patricians. They were an inherited class. Okay? Once you were in the patricians, you inherited that. You could even become poor, and you could still become or still stay a patrician. They were large and landowners. Many were senators. They controlled Roman politics and religion, and they were judges. Decurion order were aristocrats of cities around the empire. They were municipal senators, required to be freeborn citizens who owned local property. And plebeians were the lowest class, a typical Roman citizen who was not a patrician, and later on, the wealthier plebeians were the middle class of Rome, and they could become senators in the later republic, and they encompassed, of course, the poor. So those are the Roman social orders. Now, there are several blue boxes in chapter 11. Let's go over some of the blue boxes. First of all, imperium. Imperium was something a Roman ruler held where he had complete control over your life. Okay? The ones who held imperium were emperors, of course, dictators, and we kind of have a different feeling what dictators are in our thinking versus what dictators were back then. A little bit different, and I'll point that out as we go along. Okay, so emperors, dictators, consuls, praetors, and master of the horse. Now, master of the horse was a temporary thing like a dictator was. Master of the horse was second in line to a dictator. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But those people held imperium. They had full control over your life. Now, my question is, what about Jesus? And what about Pilate? We just mentioned Pilate was a prefect. Is he in the list of holding imperium? No. A prefect did not have imperium. Why was he allowed to kill Jesus? Because he wasn't a Roman citizen. If Jesus had been a Roman citizen, Pilate would not have been able to condemn Jesus to death, most likely. Pilate would have had to go to Lucius Lamina, who was the governor of the Syrian province. He was Proconsul of the Syrian province. A Proconsul means a former consul, and if you were a former consul or a Proconsul, you held imperium of that province. So don't care who Jesus was, Roman citizen, whatever, Lamia could have done away with him, could have killed him. Pilate could not if he had been. Now, if Paul had been in this situation as a Roman citizen, Pilate would not have been able to kill him legally. Okay? He would have had to go to the governor of the Syrian province who held imperium over that province. Okay? Make sense? That's imperium. Pro means former, as I just mentioned. So proconsul was a former consul. They only held imperium if they were over a province. Over that province, they held imperium. A propraetor was a former praetor. We're going to talk about these titles here in just a minute as we go through. We went through the social order. We're going to go through the government office order here in just a minute, okay? So propraetor is a former praetor, okay? Proscription is another term that you need to be familiar with as we go along. That was the process of getting rid of your enemies. There were two main prescriptions during the late Republic, the time that we're interested in, okay, between a man named Sulla and a man named Marius, okay, that were very big into prescriptions. If you were proscripted, you would be taken out of your bed at night and you'd be never seen again. Or if you were seen again, your head might be on a spear in the Roman Forum, okay? That's what you did to your enemies. You proscripted them. That's what we're talking about here. We'll talk about some specific examples. Marius, again, and Sulla, who were big into proscription. They were against each other, so Sulla would proscript Marius, anybody that followed Marius, and Marius would proscript anybody that followed Sulla. Okay? That's proscription. Now, if you were married to somebody who was proscribed, then you're out of luck. You lost all your wealth that you had. You weren't allowed to marry anymore. You're out of luck. Okay? So that's proscription. Next up, dictator. So a man who became a dictator is a little bit different than we think about today. When we think of dictator, we think of like a country, like a third world country, and somebody rises to power by killing all his enemies and rising to this position, and he's dictator for life. You know, as long as somebody doesn't kill him, he stays in charge, right? Okay? A little bit different then. Dictator was a selection by somebody, by the Senate, okay, to be a dictator. It was typically during times of emergency. It was typically during times of war. The typical length of time for a dictator was 6 months or less, okay? There's some good examples of people who ruled for 16 days, for example. Senatus is a good example. Ruled for 16 days, he was elevated to dictator, and then he gave up his dictatorship, okay? It all changed a little bit later on in the late Republic, okay, under Sulla. Okay, and then Julius Caesar became a dictator, and he became a dictator many, many times. In fact, he became a dictator for life in 44 BC, but life didn't last too long. He lasted about another month before the senators had enough of him and killed him on the Ides of March, 44 BC. You remember what Ides of March mean? You remember Ides, right, from week number 1? A couple of people nodding. Yeah, that was a long time ago. All right, the 15th of March, 44 BC was when Caesar was assassinated. Okay, he was the last dictator of the Roman Republic. All right. More blue boxes. Now, is that more squared or 2 times more? I don't know. So I have a T-shirt that says Ho Cubed. It's a Christmas T-shirt. It says Ho Cubed. And so I'm asking a question for all the mathematicians and scientists in here. Is that correct terminology? I don't know. I think it should be 3 times Ho. 3 times Ho? Okay. I asked my kids. My kids are pretty smart. One's an astrophysics. He's got his PhD in astrophysics. Another's got degrees in computer science. I asked them. They said, we don't care. So help me. I care. I need to know this. I think it's 2 times or 3 times ho, because if it's ho cubed, that's a whole lot of ho, right? So I might digress. I don't know. Let me know. All right, cursus honorum. The cursus honorum was the path by which you started service in the Roman Empire. At the very bottom was a quaestor. At age 30, you could run elected office. You could run to be a quaestor. And I'll show you what those offices are in a little bit. So this is kind of the stepping stones. As you age, as you got older, you could run for different offices. Okay, so quaestor at age 30, thou at 36, praetor at 39, consul at 42 if you're a plebeian, or 40 for a patrician. And you could be a censor any age after being a consul. And as I mentioned, ex-consuls became proconsuls, ex-praetors became propraetors, okay? And each could rule over Roman province. Caesar, the word Caesar is a nomenclature of the Caesars, obviously, the emperors of Rome. It goes back to Julius Caesar, obviously, okay? But Julius Caesar was not an emperor. But Julius Caesar set up all the structure for Octavian later to become emperor. He was a dictator for life. He really kind of controlled the Senate. He did appointments and he made laws and all these things that Octavian would later do. So Caesar became kind of the embodiment of what an emperor would be. So emperors are called Caesar. Caesar Augustus, Caligula, Caesar Caligula, Caesar Nero, whatever, okay? Caesar became a title. We see that follow on through history through the German czars, for example, or the Russian czars, rather, the German Kaisers, okay? Those were all from the root word of Caesar. All right. Now, let's talk about Roman government offices. At the very top was the emperor. He only existed during the time of the empire. Makes sense, okay? He held the power of absolute imperium. It doesn't matter who you are, he could kill you if he wanted to. He was the ultimate ruler of Rome from 27 BC forward, okay, with Octavian, or Caesar Augustus. A dictator held the power of imperium. He was elected by the Senate for a 6-month term, typically during emergencies, as I said. The office was abolished after the assassination of Julius Caesar. There were about 90 dictators throughout the Republic, 2 of whom were at the very end of the Republic, toward the late Republic, Sulla and Julius Caesar. We'll talk about those dictatorships in just a minute, okay? A tribune of the plebs, another very powerful office, even though he was a plebe. And remember the social order? You got patricians, senators, equestrians, whatever. The very bottom was the plebeians. But a tribune of the plebs, who was a plebeian, was a very powerful office, okay? But as powerful as he was, he would not be able to veto the decision of a dictator, okay? Master of the horse was only an office that existed during a dictatorship. He was second in charge to a dictator, and only his decisions could only be overridden by the dictator. Okay, so he had almost ultimate imperium, but just one step below the dictator. Next up, consul. There were always supposed to be 2 consuls during Roman. In the Republic, they had more power than they did during the Empire. During the Empire, they were picked by the emperor, okay, and they were mostly just a ceremonial office, okay. Many consuls were consuls many, many times. Okay. But we'll see that throughout. They had to agree on decisions since they could veto each other. There were, well, as I mentioned, 2 elected annually as executives of the Roman government on the Republican, and 2 selected by the emperor during the empire. They held the power of imperium. There are 2 types of consuls, consuls ordinarius and consul suffectus. An ordinary consul was one that was just like clockwork, okay, selected in the Republic, voted on every year, or selected every year. A consul suffectus was if a consul ordinarius died, or if a consul ordinarius was kicked out for some reason, or whatever, they would bring in a consul suffectus. Okay, so somebody out of the ordinary order of things. The primary duty was to command military forces. We see that throughout the history of the Republic. They presided over Senate meetings, and again, mainly became an honorary position during the Empire. The general age was 40 or 42, depending on your social standing. Praetor held the power of imperium. They served first as generals and judges. A dictator was called, another name for him was called Praetor Maximus. Maximum Praetor, big Praetor, held the power of ultimate imperium. Praetors issued edicts and established law. They were in charge of games and festivals during the empire. General age was 39 or older to be a praetor. All right. Proconsul served in place of a consul, which is pro in place of, or former. They often became governors of major provinces. We see the Syrian province had a proconsul. We've seen that throughout the history we've talked about. And they had imperium over the region they ruled. Princeps Senatus was the leader of the Senate. 5-year terms. They were chosen by the censors. We'll talk about censors in just a minute. A senator, there were 100 members, 100 senators during the monarchy. This was increased to 300 at the beginning of the Republic. Sulla increased it to 600 in 80 BC. It was increased to 900 under Julius Caesar and reduced back to 600 under Caesar Augustus. Okay. The duties, legislation, financial matters, foreign relations, they supervised the state religion, they issued decrees, they did not receive a salary because it was required for them to be rich. Why give them a salary if you're already so rich, right? Kind of like Trump. I'm sure he still donates his salary to charity. I think he did that in his first term. I'm sure he does that still. Okay, he's so rich. Why take the salary of the President of the United States? Okay, same with them. They did not receive a salary because they had to have $11 million-ish of wealth to even be a senator. All right, next up, a censor. This was held after a person was a consul, typically. So it's a very powerful position also. They kept records of people and property. They assessed taxes. Augustus subsumed the power of censor when he became emperor. He is the one that ordered the census that caused Joseph and Mary and Jesus to be in Bethlehem when Jesus was born. Okay? He was emperor, but he was using the power of the office of censor, which he subsumed, to order that census. Okay? Prefect commanded various social services, such as you have prefect of the city, prefect of the firefighters, prefect of the grain supply, whatever. Okay? Pontius Pilate, as we mentioned, was a prefect of equestrian order. Even though Tacitus and Josephus call him a procurator, we found a stone in Caesarea that says Pontius Pilate, the prefect. Okay? And which is what the Bible tells us also. All right? Procurator, they were oversee over provincial treasury. They could be a governor of a lesser province. We've seen some of those, right? We've seen a bunch of those. Felix, Festus, Albinus, Florus, to name some of the few that we covered about 2 or 3 weeks. You remember all those people, right? Okay. Those are all procurators, okay? They were serving under a proconsul, specifically of the Syrian province that we've studied about, okay? They collected taxes. Next up, a propraetor, typically a commander of a legion. They were a lot of times governor of a province. They served in place of a praetor, in other words, a former praetor. Aedile, he supervised markets, public games, etc. It was an elected office. He was in charge of weights and measures. He could be a patrician or a plebeian, and he had to be 36 years old or older. Tribune of the Plebs, a very powerful office, even though the guy was a plebeian. Ugh. Plebeians were the low social order of Rome. Tribune of the Plebs, though, he could veto decisions of the Senate. That's pretty impressive. He could veto decisions of the Assembly of the Plebs. He could veto other Roman magistrates. He's a very powerful person. It was an elected office, but this was an attempt by the Roman government to make sure the plebeians had some say in the government, a very powerful say in the government. Okay? Some of the emperors didn't like the Tribune of the Plebs later, and they showed their displeasure for the plebes in certain ways. May talk about some of that. Okay. A Quaestor, treasurers, they supervise financial affairs. They're administrative assistant to the general or governor, basically financial secretaries. They could be a patrician or a plebeian. It was an elected office during the Republican and an appointed office during the Empire. They maintained public records, and the general age was 30 or older. It's kind of the bottom of the cursus honorum. Remember the stepping stones on how to move up into elected offices in the Republic and then the Empire. A client king was not part of the Roman bureaucracy. This is like Herod the Great. He was a Jew. He was an Idumean Jew, but he was a Jew. He was not a Roman. Okay, I guess he was a Roman eventually became a Roman citizen or whatever. Okay, but he ruled Judea as a client king. He really was not part of the Roman hierarchy of offices. Okay. Civil servant. The only civil servants in the Republic were the assistants, the quaestors. The civil service grew pretty big during the Empire, kind of like the U.S. government today, right? It's pretty big today, okay? But it was not that way under the Republic. They performed such duties as maintaining roads, buildings, water supply, etc. A Curatore oversaw the finances of individual cities. Was a Procurator a former Curator? No. That's the only place where our logic falls apart. A Procurator was not a former Curator. Okay. A publican, tax collector. Matthew was a publican. He acquired that office by being the highest bidder. All right. A lictor. These were Roman citizens who guarded members of the imperium. Remember, imperium was the power to do whatever you want to do. Basically, you kill people, you send them off to banishment or whatever you want to do. You hold imperium. Lictors protected you, like the Secret Service protects our president today. Okay, the dictator had 24 lictors. Consuls had 12. Praetors had 6. Okay, and they received a salary from the state. Provincial governor, promagistrates, they were appointed by the Senate during the Republic. During the Empire period, senatorial province governors were appointed by the Senate, and we talked about this before. And imperial province governors were appointed by the emperor. Okay. Imperial provinces, you remember this, right? Imperial provinces had legions there. They had a military to keep them under control. They were more problematic provinces. But the imperial provinces that were more problematic, that had military, were controlled by the emperor, which meant the emperor controlled the military, right? The senators didn't control the military because the provinces they controlled were non-imperial provinces, and they typically didn't have a military. They only had local people who kind of protected the people who had imperium. Okay? All right. Roman officials in the Bible, and I guess this is as far as we'll get. We're not getting as far as we thought. So there are 4 emperors that are mentioned in the Bible, 3 mentioned, 1 implied. Augustus, he ordered the census at Jesus' birth. Tiberius, he was the emperor during Jesus' ministry. Claudius, there was a famine during his time. He expelled the Jews from Rome. We read about in Acts 11 and also chapter 18. And Nero, who's not named specifically, but he was the emperor to whom Paul appealed. Remember the story? Who did Paul appeal? Which Herod was he under? Oh. Herod Agrippa II. Yes. BDL, birth of Jesus, the first generation, Herod the Great. Death of Jesus, the sons, Herod Antipas, Archelaus, Philip the Tetrarch, okay, and the other Philip, Herod Philip Boethus, okay. The grandson, Herod Agrippa I, that was early apostles, Herod Agrippa II, later apostles. You've got to remember this. You're going to have a test on this. You've got to remember this.
What day is the test?
Start.
What day is the test?
I'm not telling. It's a pop test. So those are the 4 emperors in the New Testament. There were a couple of proconsuls mentioned in the New Testament also. The proconsul of Cyprus, Sergius Paulus, mentioned in Acts chapter 13, and Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia, who dismissed the charges against Paul in Corinth in Acts chapter 18. 1 Roman governor mentioned, Quirinius, who is the governor of Syria. He oversaw the census during Jesus' birth, the one that Octavian ordered, okay, as censor. Then we have 1 Roman prefect mentioned, Pontius Pilate. We know all about him, who presided over Jesus' trial. A couple of procurators mentioned, Felix and Festus. We went through a bunch of others, but Felix heard Paul's case, and then Festus heard Paul's case again, and that's where he appealed to the Emperor Nero, which kind of a shame that he did, I guess. Several Roman centurions and military officers. We have an unnamed centurion at Capernaum who sought healing for his servant. We read about that in Matthew and Luke. Cornelius, the first Gentile convert in Acts chapter 10. Julius, who escorted Paul to Rome. Okay. The centurion at the cross who said, surely this man must be the Son of God, when all the earthquake and the darkness and everything happened. Okay. And then Lysias, who protected Paul from the Jewish mob in Acts chapters 21 through 24. And there's one other government official in the Bible, Publius, who was a chief man of Malta. He hosted Paul after his shipwreck in Acts chapter 28 on missionary journey number 4. The Roman Republic. We're not going to get into that. We will start that next week. Okay. We'll give you a little break, let you go home, study for your test next week. Thank y'all. See you next week.